In the early months of 1942, Imperial Japan stood at the height of its power. Pearl Harbor had shocked the world, stunning the United States and crippling the Pacific Fleet. The Philippines were collapsing. Malaya, Hong Kong, and Singapore had fallen in rapid succession. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces advanced with a speed that left even their own commanders astonished. Japan had crafted an image of invincibility, an empire expanding so rapidly that its leaders began to believe their own mythology. Tokyo, the heart of the empire, was considered untouchable. No enemy aircraft had ever dared approach it. The Japanese people had been promised that their homeland was beyond reach, shielded by a divine wind and a mighty navy. But on the morning of April 18, 1942, that illusion was shattered in a matter of minutes. It would be the day when American bombers struck the capital itself, and when the Japanese high command realized, for the first time, that they were not as invincible as they believed. The story began months earlier, on the other side of the Pacific. After Pearl Harbor, the United States needed a symbolic victory, something to show its people that Japan was not untouchable. President Franklin D. Roosevelt demanded a strike deep inside Japanese territory. Military planners considered this an almost impossible task. The U.S. had no bases close enough to Japan. The bombers of the era lacked the range to fly from American territory to Tokyo. But one officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Herald Doolittle, believed he had a daring solution: launch medium bombers from an aircraft carrier. It had never been attempted before. The idea seemed insane. B-25 bombers were far larger and heavier than any aircraft ever launched from a carrier. But Doolittle believed it could be done. What followed was one of the boldest operations of the war. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, life went on with an air of arrogant confidence. Japanese propaganda insisted that no American aircraft could reach the home islands. The Imperial Navy, the pride of the nation, was believed to form an impenetrable shield. Even as Japan expanded across Asia and the Pacific, the people of Tokyo felt secure, protected by distance, by geography, and by the military brilliance of their commanders. Behind the scenes, however, some Japanese officers worried that the Americans would attempt something unpredictable. These concerns were often dismissed by senior leaders. The Japanese high command had become convinced that the United States was a weak, disorganized nation lacking the will to strike back. They believed America needed years to rebuild its fleet, and that any attack on Japan itself was impossible. On April 18, 1942, that assumption was shattered. As the skies over Tokyo buzzed with the usual hum of industry and civilian life, an unfamiliar drone echoed high above the city. A few civilians spotted aircraft approaching. At first, they assumed they must be Japanese planes. But then the bombs began to fall. American B-25 bombers, launched from the USS Hornet far out at sea, roared over Tokyo, dropping bombs on the capital in broad daylight. Explosions rocked residential neighborhoods, military factories, and the very heart of the city. Fires erupted across industrial districts. Anti-aircraft guns scrambled to respond. Air raid sirens screamed for the first time. Civilians panicked. The myth of Japanese invulnerability evaporated instantly. Inside the Imperial Palace, military officers scrambled to understand what was happening. Reports came in scattered and chaotic. Enemy bombers sighted over Tokyo. They are twin-engine aircraft. They appear to be American. Confusion spread. How could American bombers be flying over Tokyo? How could enemy planes get so close without detection? Japanese radar was still in its infancy, and air defenses had been oriented southward, anticipating attacks from bases the U.S. did not yet possess. At the Imperial General Headquarters, the Japanese high command gathered in shock and disbelief. The room fell into a stunned silence as the scale of the raid became clear. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor, was not present when the first reports arrived, but he would soon receive the most humiliating news of his career. American aircraft had bombed the capital of the empire. General Hajime Sugiyama, the Army Chief of Staff, reportedly uttered the first blunt reaction. "This is impossible." Another officer snapped, "No American bomber has the range." But the facts were undeniable. Tokyo had been hit. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Imperial Navy General Staff, became pale as he read the reports. He finally spoke a single sentence that captured the shock of the entire military establishment. "Our homeland has been violated." Those words were unprecedented. In the history of Japan, no enemy had successfully bombed Tokyo. Even during World War I, the home islands remained untouched. Now the American strike had pierced the heart of the empire. Yamamoto, upon learning the truth, reacted with a cold fury. Though outwardly calm, he understood immediately what the High Command did not. The Doolittle Raid was not simply a symbolic attack. It was a strategic disaster for Japan's prestige and propaganda narrative. Yamamoto is reported to have said, "This will have great repercussions." He realized instantly that the Japanese people, who had been promised security and divine protection, would now question their leaders. The military's credibility was shaken. Inside the palace war room, officers argued about where the bombers had come from. Some speculated they must have flown from Soviet territory, an option long considered impossible. Others believed that perhaps an American secret base existed somewhere in China. Finally, intelligence officers pieced together the truth. The aircraft had been launched from an American aircraft carrier. The realization provoked another stunned silence. One senior officer muttered, "They dared to bring land bombers off a carrier? Impossible." But the impossible had just happened. The Japanese High Command's reaction was not just disbelief, it was humiliation. For months, they had promised the people that Japan was winning everywhere, that the United States was weak, and that the home islands were safe. The Doolittle Raid shattered that illusion. Even though the physical damage was limited, the psychological impact was devastating. Tokyo had been attacked. Fires burned in its streets. The emperor's subjects had been shaken. And the Japanese High Command felt exposed. The rage inside the military leadership quickly turned outward. They sought someone to blame. Their fury fell upon China because after dropping their bombs, the American attackers flew toward Chinese territory, hoping to land there with the help of Chinese resistance fighters. When Japanese officers learned that some Chinese villagers and soldiers had aided the American crews, their anger erupted into brutality. Japan launched a massive retaliatory campaign across eastern China, killing an estimated 250,000 civilians in the Zhejiang-Jiangxi region. It was one of the darkest and least known atrocities of the war, driven directly by the humiliation Japan felt in Tokyo. Within the High Command, the shock of the raid forced immediate strategic changes. Admiral Yamamoto insisted that the U.S. carrier fleet had demonstrated it was a direct threat. As long as American carriers remained at sea, Japan was vulnerable. Yamamoto argued that the U.S. Navy must be lured into a decisive battle and destroyed once and for all. The bombing of Tokyo had made this urgently clear. And so the Doolittle Raid became the catalyst for one of the most important decisions in Japanese naval strategy, the plan to attack Midway. The Japanese High Command believed that the Americans, emboldened by their success, would fight to defend Midway Atoll, a small but strategically vital base west of Hawaii. Yamamoto believed he could trap and annihilate the U.S. carrier fleet there. He assured the High Command that once the carriers were destroyed, Japan would regain total dominance of the Pacific. In the weeks that followed, the resentment and humiliation from the Doolittle Raid hardened into determination. Senior officers demanded vengeance. Newspapers were censored heavily to hide the scale of the panic that had gripped Tokyo. The public was told the raid was insignificant, even as the High Command knew it was anything but. Inside private meetings, some officers openly admitted the raid had shattered their confidence in Japan's defensive perimeter. One high-ranking general said, "If they can strike Tokyo once, they can strike again." Another senior admiral concluded, "Our defenses are too thin. We believed our enemy was incapable. We were wrong, but these admissions were never shared publicly." Japan maintained a facade of calm and control. Beneath that surface, however, the military elite were panicking. What the Japanese High Command feared most was not the bombs themselves, but what they represented: American ingenuity, daring, and unpredictability. The Doolittle Raid proved that the United States was not the weak, indecisive nation that Japanese propaganda portrayed. It showed that America was willing to attempt the impossible, to innovate, to take risks. It showed that the U.S. Navy had not been defeated. And it showed that the war would not be won simply because Japan had achieved early victories. In Tokyo, on the day of the raid, Emperor Hirohito himself was escorted to safety as smoke rose from the eastern districts. Though no bomb struck the imperial palace, the symbolism was potent. The emperor had been threatened for the first time in his reign. This fact terrified the High Command. They feared the loss of face. They feared the weakening of public confidence. And above all, they feared what Yamamoto feared, that the Americans were just getting started. In the weeks after the raid, Japanese intelligence scoured the Pacific trying to track down the U.S. carrier group responsible. They never found them. The Americans had escaped. The carriers that had launched the raid Hornet and Enterprise returned safely to Pearl Harbor. The Japanese High Command felt mocked by fate. Their inability to punish the attackers deepened their humiliation. This frustration shaped Japan's next major decisions. Yamamoto's plan for a decisive naval battle at Midway, previously debated and questioned, now became an obsession. The High Command approved it with little resistance. They believed destroying the American carrier fleet would erase the stain of the Doolittle Raid. But in their rush for revenge, they underestimated American codebreakers who had deciphered their operational plans. The Doolittle Raid had set in motion a chain of events that would lead directly to Japan's greatest naval defeat. Inside the Japanese High Command, there was no agreement on how to interpret the raid. Some believed it was a desperate gesture that would have no long-term significance. Others believed it signaled the beginning of a prolonged American counteroffensive. But all of them understood one reality: the raid had changed everything. Their confidence was shaken, their assumptions were flawed. Their belief in the war's inevitability was broken. Among the Japanese people, the raid created a quiet but growing unease. Civilians who had once laughed off American threats now wondered whether the war would eventually reach their homes. The police warned citizens to report any unusual aircraft noises. Air raid drills intensified. Anti-aircraft defenses were expanded. The government issued new propaganda insisting that the raid had been insignificant, but the public knew this was a lie. They had seen the fires with their own eyes. As for the High Command, their private conversations revealed a deeper fear, that the raid exposed critical vulnerabilities in Japan's industrial heartland. Tokyo, Nagoya, Yokohama, Kobe all were densely packed, with wooden structures highly vulnerable to fire. If the Americans ever began large-scale bombing raids, the devastation would be unimaginable. One general warned quietly, "If they ever learn to burn our cities, our war will become impossible." His warning would prove prophetic 2 years later, when American B-29 firebombing raids reduced Tokyo to ashes. But all of that was still far in the future. On April 18, 1942, the Japanese High Command faced a much more immediate question. What would they tell the Emperor? What explanation could they give for allowing American bombers to strike the heart of Japan? The official report softened the language, minimizing the damage. But the private meeting with the Emperor was tense. One officer admitted, "We were unprepared." Another said, "Our defenses failed." And the Emperor, usually reserved, reportedly responded with a simple, chilling remark: "You assured me this could not happen." The Doolittle Raid was militarily minor but psychologically catastrophic. It forced Japan into a strategic overreaction. It accelerated plans that were not yet ready. It pushed the High Command into aggressive moves that would ultimately backfire. And it planted a seed of doubt that would grow in the minds of both the Japanese leadership and the Japanese people. Yet the most revealing response of all came from Admiral Yamamoto, the commander who understood the enemy better than any of his colleagues. After hearing the full details of the raid, he reportedly said, "I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant." But what he said next, less famous but even more ominous, captured the true impact of the Doolittle Raid on Japan's High Command. And now that he is awakened, he will want vengeance. That vengeance would come at Midway, in the Solomons, in the Marianas, and eventually over the skies of Tokyo in a firestorm unlike anything the world had ever seen. But on that single day in April, as the smoke cleared and the High Command struggled with the unimaginable truth, the Japanese Empire felt something it had not felt since the war began: fear. The Doolittle Raid had struck not only Tokyo, but the soul of the empire.